Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for our Using SLAs and KPIs for Effective Vendor Performance Management webinar. My name is Jessie Redmond, and I will be your host. On your screen, you should see multiple widgets that you can use, including Ask Question, Media Player, Slides, Related Content, Speaker Bio, Request Demo, and Help. If you are unfamiliar with our webinars, all the widget boxes are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to maximize your screen space. At the bottom of your screen in the toolbar are icon buttons you can use to show and hide those widgets. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner of the widget. If you experience any issues or have technical questions, you can use the Help widget or submit them along with any other questions through the Ask Question widget. Don't worry, we do capture all questions throughout the session. We will answer some during the webcast, but those that we do not have a chance to answer live, we will address with you via email. Today's live session is eligible for 1 CPE credit. If you wish to receive this credit, please remember to be logged in individually with your own credentials, answer all 3 polling questions that appear on your screen during today's presentation, be in attendance for the entire live 1-hour session, and complete the follow-up survey. We'll send the link to the follow-up survey 24 hours after the live session. If you meet all requirements, we'll send your CPE certificate within 7 to 10 business days following survey submission. With us today, we have Hillary Dewhurst, VendMinder's Head of Third-Party Risk Education and Advocacy. She will provide an overview of the vendor performance management process and share essential details regarding identifying and establishing SLAs and KPIs, how to monitor and manage performance effectively, and how to spot and address declining vendor performance early on to avoid more significant issues later. You will see a link to a copy of today's slide deck, a link to our website, a link to our samples library, links to our vendor performance management steps and questions to ask infographic, using KPIs to maintain strong SLAs in vendor relationships ebook, 3 ways to measure vendor performance infographic, as well as a link to our library of additional resources, all in the related content widget. With all that being said, I'd like to hand it over to Hillary. The floor is yours.
Well, hello and welcome everyone. Today we are going to be getting into vendor performance management. And we're going to start our discussion with why it's important and move on to all of our KPIs to understand the difference between service level agreements, KPIs, and other metrics and how to develop them. We're going to talk about the vendor performance management process, as well as recommendations to make that process more effective, and then we'll wrap up with some key takeaways. So let's get started. Okay, so what is vendor performance management? Well, it's pretty much what it sounds like, managing the performance of the vendor. But to get a little more granular, it's a routine process that's ensuring your vendors are delivering what we expect them to. And because this is a routine process, it means we do it all the time. It also entails verifying that the products and services are delivered on time, with the right quality, and at the right price. The key word here is verifying, as if we confirm, not assume, that it's happening. And vendor performance management also helps your organization ensure that the vendor relationship is actually helping your organization achieve its strategic goals. So managing your vendor's performance is essential. And if you aren't managing their performance, you're really not managing risk effectively. And I'm not just saying that to make anyone feel bad, but the truth is, when you think about it, we engage vendors for a reason. They're always supposed to help us fix that problem or realize an opportunity. And vendor management is the key to making sure that those vendors are helping you meet your strategic goals. So for example, if I engage a vendor to take over an inefficient process, I need to know that yes, using that vendor is more efficient than performing that activity in-house. And that improved efficiency is helping us reach more customers, for example, or maybe more revenue. But maybe the efficiency is there, but the output is low quality. But then, right? So what if that vendor is pretty efficient, but isn't really helping us reach more customers in that case? then we might need to rethink our approach. So when it comes to performance management, we need to verify that the vendor is providing the products and services as we expect them to, with the right level of quality and the agreed upon price. We also need to consistently confirm that the benefit to our organization outweighs the risk posed by the relationship. So interestingly, vendor performance management starts a lot sooner than you think. It really starts the moment you start having discussions with a supplier. And it's all about setting expectations with the vendor and creating back and forth communication where you can really understand and develop the must-haves in that product or service, making sure that the service levels that you are looking for meet industry norms, identifying any potential penalties if those service level agreements are not met, and talking about the key performance or risk indicators that we're going to use to substantiate those service levels. We're also going to talk about who's going to provide the data and reporting to support that management and how often we're going to get and review those reports. Okay, so we know the vendor's responsible for performing, but who's responsible for managing vendor performance? First and foremost, the vendor owner is responsible and accountable for effectively managing that vendor performance, managing any issues and any remediation, and holding that vendor accountable. As they say, the buck stops here for performance management. It's all about the vendor owner. But third-party risk management or vendor risk management teams still oversee that process and make sure that everything is documented, that they're tracking issues and holding the vendor owners accountable. And then finally, senior management is responsible for making sure the policy is enforced and that vendor owners and third-party or vendor risk management owners are doing their jobs. Good vendor performance management has at least 4 components. So the first one is established and agreed upon performance measures that are going to identify what the vendor is responsible for. It's important that both parties agree upon what's going to be measured and if there's going to be any penalties for misperformance. So data collection and reporting. We always need a way to measure if the performance is where it should be. That means that both parties must agree on the data types, sources, and formats, and who's going to provide that data and how often. We need performance review meetings. So once we agree on all the metrics, data, and reporting, we need to establish a performance review cadence. And these are formal meetings scheduled at regular and predictable intervals. Finally, when there are any performance issues, they have to be tracked and managed. And by managed, I mean that performance issues are addressed ASAP. So we need to document and include the reason for the issue, being that root cause, and the remediation plan and the due date. So those are the 4 components of really good performance management. So of course, everyone wants to jump right in with SLAs and KPIs, but really good performance management always starts way before you ink the contract or even developing those metrics. It always starts with understanding how a vendor is intended to support your organizational goals. So every organization has goals, objectives. Here's some listed here. Maybe we want to increase revenue or our net promoter score, get a new industry segment going. And of course, nobody expects that any one vendor is going to help you meet all of your goals. But we should be able to articulate how a vendor contributes or supports a specific goal and how it's going to help your organization meet those goals. Because that understanding and articulation are really the foundation of excellent performance management. All right, from the beginning, we need to think about those objectives and how our vendors are going to help us get there. So we need to ask a couple questions. The first one is, how does this specific vendor help us meet a specific objective? What actions or service levels from the vendor are going to help us meet those goals? And how are we going to measure success? Okay, we know you love examples, So today we're going to work with an example throughout the presentation. And in this example, we have a fictitious company. They're called So Nice General Store, or SGS for short. And this is a retailer that has a bit of a cult following. They sell a lot of apparel and accessories and some household goods like towels and linen, but people love them because they sell organic cotton, products that are manufactured in the United States. They were also known for the really charming stores and excellent customer service, but shopping has changed a lot over the past few years. And just like many other retailers, they've had to close their brick and mortar stores and move to an online model for the first time. Now, surprisingly, this turned out very well for the company and sales increased dramatically. But their business changed a lot too. So for the first time, they were really able to really track repeat business and customer loyalty. And the number of items sold in a single order went way up. But with this change, they were also getting a lot more returns than ever before, and the number of customer service inquiries, it also went up. So they've decided to outsource their customer service to the Right Answer company, which provides an inbound call center service. Okay, so let's look at some of the organizational goals that SGS has for customer acquisition and retention. Now, they want to do a lot of things here, but some of these goals will translate really well to that call center service. And so Right Answer Call Center is going to be responsible for improving customer satisfaction scores. We want them to have an NPS, or Net Promoter Score, of above 60 and increase the exchange rate versus the return rate. All right, so while we're thinking about this, I believe it's time for our first poll. Jessie?
And this brings us to the first poll question of the day. You should see the poll question now in the slides area. If you have any issues, please feel free to send us a message using the Ask Question widget, and we will be happy to assist. As a reminder, if you wish to receive the CPE credit for today's session, you must answer all poll questions and be in attendance for the entire live session. This poll question is, at my organization, vendor owners are responsible for managing vendor performance. Yes, no, or not sure. Hillary, we have some time to answer a question that's come in from the audience.
Okay, great.
What is the difference between a service level agreement and a key performance indicator?
That's a really good question, and it's one that we need to really keep in mind, because when we're talking about service level agreements, these are parts of your contract that outline what the minimum acceptable service is. Now, these can be done in sort of a narrative format, or they could use what we call KPIs to substantiate that performance. So, for example, let's say that you have system availability as your SLA. The KPI that we're going to use is going to be 98%, right? So we need the system to be available. That's the agreement. The KPI, or the measurement that we're going to use to substantiate that SLA, is 98%. So you can just use KPIs for your SLAs, but SLAs refer to the agreement, not the measurement. I hope that helps.
Thanks, everyone, for answering that poll question. Here are the results. By the way, you may have noticed reactions such as a thumbs up or heart coming across the screen. If you find this feature distracting, you can turn it off by clicking the 4 arrows in the top right-hand corner of the slides widget, which will expand the slides to full screen and no longer show the reactions. Before moving on, just a reminder that in the related content widget, you can find our vendor performance management steps and questions to ask infographic. With that, I'll hand it back to you, Hillary.
Okay, so when it comes to vendor performance monitoring and scorecards, we're going to take a time out here because it's really important to learn how to design and use these tools effectively. So understanding the differences, say, between a targeted goal, or knowing if a metric is subjective or objective, can really make all the difference in effective performance management. So some of the concepts I'm going to share today may not work for all of you, and that's okay. There are really endless opinions and methods for performance management, but I'm going to share some tried and true methods today that have proved to be really effective during my third-party risk management career. All right, first things first, what is a metric? Well, metrics are a form of measurement, right? They're there to measure or evaluate something, and we are using them as tools in our performance management. So let's stop and take a moment to get familiar with all the different types of metrics we might be dealing with. Okay, the first thing to understand is that metrics come in two flavors. They're either objective or quantitative, or subjective or qualitative. So both types of metrics are valid and both can be used when we're evaluating vendor performance. However, we should really be sure that objective and quantitative metrics account for most of our metrics in the performance management process. So let's learn more about them to understand why. Okay, so the first flavor of metric is an objective metric, also known as quantitative metric. So this has the root word of quantity, which means something that can be counted or measured. So obviously volumes, capacity, time, price, cost, etc. When we're measuring performance, objective or quantitative measurements should really account for most of our metrics. And if you want to know why, it's because it helps us get a consistent and comparable measure that's going to allow us to see performance over time within a specific context. So to use our call center for an example, we know that customers expect customer service agents to pick up the phone and resolve the issue quickly. So we might measure the average answer time, the length of the call, and if the issue was resolved, because these are all fact-based metrics we can measure. Okay, but what if we expect the agent that's picking up the phone to be friendly and kind? That's kind of different. How do we measure that, and who defines what friendly and kind are? Because this is an example of a subjective metric or a qualitative metric, and it's accounting for something that's observed, experienced, or felt. This can be a lot harder to measure. And it also can be extremely variable depending on the perspective doing the measuring. It's also important to consider that the subjective measurement can change depending on the mood someone is in. So let's use an example of a tired young parent who hasn't had much sleep lately. They call the customer service number and they get put on hold, which utterly exasperates them because they've only had a few more minutes before their child wakes up from a nap. This customer might perceive that experience differently than someone who was better rested and didn't feel under the same time pressures. So you see this a lot with customer service. You could measure your call center by how your customers feel, but let's say you're running a collections call center. Your customers may not feel that great to begin with, so it's really important to make sure whenever you can that subjective metrics are supported and balanced by objective metrics. So now let's talk about service level agreements, key performance indicators, and key risk indicators. All right, let's start with service level agreements, or SLAs as we like to call them. You know, some people use the term SLA and KPI, which stands for key performance indicator, kind of interchangeably, but they're really not the same. SLAs are documented performance agreements, and they're representing the minimum must-haves for the engagement. So these are the things that are deal breakers, right? These are the service levels that we absolutely need. It's also important to understand that because those service level agreements represent the most kind of mission critical expectations, there's usually an agreed upon penalty if they are not met. So in a lot of cases, that might be a rebate or discount or some other kind of financial remedy, but there might be other treatments as determined by the organization and the vendor. They'll also, you know, it's good to know that if you keep breaking the SLA, that contract termination is usually the result. Okay, so here are some examples of things you might need to create an SLA around. Again, remember these are contracted levels of service or performance that represent your must-haves. These are the deal breakers. And it's important to understand that not all SLAs have punitive consequences. So for some specific services, SLAs are used to incent above average performance. So for example, let's say every month your call center has a really high customer satisfaction rate, maybe above 90%, they get a little bit of an incentive or a bonus. You do see that a lot in call service centers. That's a pretty common structure. All right, let's take a quick look at sort of the components of the service level agreement. So first of all, again, these are always created in collaboration with your vendor, and it should define overall objectives, right? What are the products and services that are provided, how the vendor is going to, improve performance or save costs or provide access, whatever it is. So we need to define the overall objectives. We also need to identify the roles and responsibilities of both the vendor and the organization. So for example, maybe your vendor's ability to deliver that product or service depends on a specific output from your organization. So an example might be you have a logistics vendor that's dependent on your sales report to do capacity in planning for their trucks. So you would need to state that in your service level agreement. We also want to state the compensation for failing to meet that SLA or any awards for exceptional service. We want to define what constitutes a critical failure, right? So even if your vendor has to issue, credits for failing to meet the SLA, if they do it over and over again, you could terminate the contract. And then we're going to identify the specific performance metrics, both key performance indicators and risk indicators, that are going to substantiate that service level agreement. And we also want to keep those to the minimum necessary because we're going to memorialize them in the contract. We also want to make sure that we're spelling out that specific KPI and KRI in the contract if it's going to be used with the SLA. Okay, so let's go back to our example for the right answer call center. So I want to show you how this is built out. So this specific SLA is about customer satisfaction. So we've listed 4 KPIs that are foundational to reaching that customer satisfaction level. So first of all, we want 70% of the calls to be resolved, and we want all calls to be resolved, but if that isn't possible, the bare minimum we'd like to see is no lower than 70, right? We want the calls resolved in 5 minutes or less, so 80% of the calls have to be resolved within 5 minutes. We also have a customer satisfaction score from that post-call survey, and we need that average to be at least 3.5 or higher, and that's on a scale of 1 to 5. We want the calls to be picked up within 180 seconds, and that means that customers do not hold for more than 3 minutes before they talk to an agent. Yes, we definitely want them to pick up more quickly, but 180 seconds is the minimum acceptable wait time before they miss the SLA. We've also identified a few key risk indicators here. We know, for example, when people hang up before the call can be answered, that's going to affect our ability to help them and drive customer satisfaction. So that's called call abandon rate. And if it goes above 20% for any reason, there has to be a specific action plan to get it back into the acceptable range. We also have another key risk indicator here, and that's for security audit findings. So the vendor needs to make sure that all physical and data security rules are followed at all times. And if there is a finding during any security audit, they're going to miss the SLA. So poor security practices pose a big risk to our organization and its customers, so we take that really seriously. All right, let's get into KPIs, or key performance indicators. So these are metrics that we generally use to measure progress towards meeting goals and to indicate trends or how well they're performing a business function. When it comes to these types of metrics, KPIs can be used independently, or we could use them to substantiate specific service level agreements. Now, it's important to remember that KPIs always tell us about something that's already happened. So they're what's called a lagging indicator, but they are very useful for helping to identify trends in performance. Now remember, which KPIs you choose is totally up to your organization and the vendor, but here are some good rules to follow. First of all, we want to structure the KPIs so they have that connection back to that organizational goal, and that they're going to measure the most important factors in reaching those objectives. You know, we don't have to have a ton of KPIs to measure every single aspect of the vendor's performance. You know, just because we can measure something doesn't necessarily mean that we should. And it's also fair to point out that KPIs can and do change sometimes. They can be refined over time or even replaced. It's really up to your organization. Now, KPIs should be able to be validated through reliable, accurate, and timely data. So we always want to know the data sources that we're going to be using to validate them, who is providing that data, and at what intervals. We also want to use what's called the SMART formula. So they're specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. Now I'm going to stop here and say that achievable and realistic are super important here, okay? No product or service is ever perfect. So when we say everything should be at 100% all the time, that's just kind of setting everyone up for failure. That's not to say you should have low standards at all. You just need to be realistic about it. So track your KPIs over time, and that's going to help you spot trends and patterns. So a good example might be back to your call center, which operates really well from January to November, but always seems to take a dive in December. Those numbers will help you and the vendor determine maybe that more personnel should be available in December. Most importantly, KPIs are always created with the vendor. This is essential because they're the ones that have to achieve the performance. And I think, you know, most of us could probably relate to a situation where we've had a manager where we identify and discuss our own KPIs versus just having them given to you. So you know which situation is preferred and which one works better. All right, let's turn to key risk indicators now, or KRIs. So KRIs are indicators or metrics that alert us to increasing risk. They're basically setting off those red flags. So when a KRI is beyond the accepted tolerance, it's our sign to take action. Now again, KRIs are what we call a leading indicator. They're trying to tell us about something that hasn't happened yet. So trying to help us avoid a risk or prevent a risk from worsening. Again, they can be validated through reliable, available, accurate, and timely data. Follow that SMART formula. We can look at them to show patterns over time, and again, created in tandem with the vendor. Now, we've talked a little bit about call centers, but I want to just share some additional KPI or KRI examples for different categories. You know, we've got marketing, IT, operations, and customer on here. It's important to think about which one of these might be subjective or which ones might be objective. Most of these fall into that objective category, right? Something that's measurable with facts or data. Now, another thing to think about is which of these might be better used as a KRI versus a KPI. So, for example, the cost per lead, we could use that as a KPI to say that they're staying within the thresholds, costing us $5 per lead, but we could also use it as a KRI if that cost starts increasing. We might need to take specific action. So just some more examples for you to consider here. And while you're thinking about that, it is time for our next poll. Jessie?
Our second poll question of the day is, my organization has a formal process to track and report vendor SLA performance. Yes, all critical or high-risk vendors. Partially for some vendors depending on the product or service. No, other, or not sure. Hillary, we have another question here that we could go ahead and answer.
Great.
Do you always have to have KRIs? We aren't using them right now. Is that an issue?
So again, what your program does is always up to you and your organization. If you're not currently using those KRIs or key risk indicators, it's not going to be the end of the world, but what The reason that you should be incorporating them is because KPIs, again, are what we call a lagging indicator. They look at something that's already happened, and that's helpful up to a point. But key risk indicators are leading indicators and give us information about something that might happen if we don't get it under control or make improvements. So a mix of both is really optimal because it's going to tell you about performance and it's going to help you manage risk. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer the poll. I'd like to quickly direct your attention back to the related content widget. Here you can find our Using KPIs to Maintain Strong SLAs and Vendor Relationships ebook. As Hillary just discussed SLAs and KPIs, be sure to check out this resource. Hillary, back to you.
Now, one other metric or category of metrics I like to talk about is stakeholder feedback, including your customers. And this can be really important because it adds a little bit something different to the mix. So it can help you ensure that you are measuring the right product or service elements, right? So if you're measuring something and your stakeholder feedback is identifying something very different, that's a clue. It also helps identify potential blind spots, right? What are we not measuring? And it's neutral. It's not favoring you or the vendor and can give you both a lot more information about what you should measure or be looking at. And it can certainly help identify those emerging risks or trends. Okay, so let's talk about data and reporting, because these are two elements that are really foundational to any performance management process. So in a lot of cases, your vendor is going to be providing that data to substantiate their own performance, and that's fine. But whenever you're reliant on a data source, you need to occasionally test that data to make sure it's accurate. Now, personally, I have experienced this one where performance data said one thing, but internal operational data said something very different. And it turned out that we had an incorrect equation, a decimal in the wrong place, and the variance over time got really crazy. So it's really important to periodically look at, validate, and test that data. So making sure that everything adds up and that you're measuring all the right factors. Okay, so another important consideration is how often we should pull and review the data. So a good rule of thumb is really built around the service cycle or that transaction length. So let's use our call center example. Let's say they get about 500 calls a week, and every one of those calls is going to contribute to the vendor's performance and your Net Promoter Score. And each one of those calls presents an opportunity for something to go good or bad, and in some cases, very bad. In this situation, we definitely want to look at that data more frequently, because if we don't spot trouble early, there are a lot of opportunities to go wrong and kind of pile up. In this case, approximately 3,000 opportunities in a month. So if you had, say, 1 of 3 calls was below your quality requirement, you could have spotted that in the first week and immediately started remediating it, or wait a month to find out that now you have 1,000 unhappy customers, or maybe you just look at it quarterly and find you have 3,000 unhappy customers. So that probably isn't the best plan. So we always want to consider the service cycle or transaction frequency when you're deciding how often to review that performance data. Now, I want to make something clear. Formal performance reviews and reviewing data are two different things. A formal performance review, which we'll talk about a little bit later, is when you sit down and have a documented meeting with your vendors to discuss performance. And you should do this at least quarterly for your high risk and critical vendors. And for your moderate vendors, you can do it maybe once or twice a year, depending on the product or service. Now, before we leave this slide, I do want to emphasize that you should not wait until just before your vendor performance review to look at how they're performing. The point of ongoing monitoring and vendor performance management is that it's constant. And the best way to avoid any unpleasant surprises is to pay attention to what's going on with your vendors all the time. All right, so let's talk about dashboards and scorecards. Now, This is a very jazzy dashboard. It's from our call center, and it's capturing most of our KPIs. Maybe we're reviewing this every week. And it's breaking out some of the data in more detail so we can see, for example, how each agent is performing. Now, this example is just for 1 week, and we might use a dashboard like this to manage and monitor vendor performance, because this is a call center, we have to look at the data really frequently because we don't want to let those small issues become big problems. And while this particular dashboard is really cool, it does have some limitations. So for example, if I submit this dashboard as evidence of vendor performance monitoring to a regulatory examiner, it is missing some important information. And while there's nothing about this particular dashboard that's bad, it's just presenting a limited set of data that can really raise more questions during an audit or exam. Now, for starters, we haven't really put targets on here for all the KPIs, and we don't really know what happened because the KPI or KRI was missed. Now, I bring this up because there are lots of software packages and data visualization programs that can help you create really awesome dashboards. And they can be really great for helping us manage and monitor vendor performance. But the truth is, most dashboards are not going to give you the full picture. So I think that's why we need to think about a more fulsome scorecard or report card for your vendor and vendor performance review. So let's talk about those for a minute. Okay, here's another example of a dashboard. Not so visually appealing, I'll admit, but it's okay, because while we may want everything to look really professional and polished, it's really about the information we're presenting that counts. And I want to emphasize this because not everyone has the resources to create fancy dashboards with gauges and charts, and they're really not a requirement. It is about the data. Now, this one does have the targets listed and more information such as the data source. I also like this one because it has the KPIs and the KRIs next to each other. And they have a KRI for every KPI, which is definitely something you can do if it makes sense. But even though this dashboard has more information, it still has some limitations. Again, dashboards are really great tools for that constant monitoring, that quick look, that visual representation of performance. But in and of themselves, they're not the same as a full vendor scorecard. So let's discuss what information should be in your scorecard versus the dashboard. Now, for the purposes of this conversation, I'm really speaking to those of you that are new to vendor scorecards or are implementing one for the first time. So if you have existing scorecards or a pro, a lot of this information will still apply, so bear with us. Now, there's just as many ways to assemble a scorecard as there are vendors, and there are countless templates and service and software offerings out there. But we're going to start with a really basic and simple way to assemble a scorecard. So there are a couple things to keep in mind here. The first of which is that a good scorecard has the essential data on a single page if you can do it. You can, of course, present that supporting data with the scorecard, but don't expect most folks to look at more than the first page. Let's talk about that for a minute. Assume that your performance scorecards for your critical vendors are part of your monthly board reporting. And a lot of organizations will have anywhere from 15 to 30 to more critical vendors. So what you include must be concise, easy to read, and to the point. We also want the scorecard to highlight the most relevant performance data. So the elements I recommend here are your vendor performance targets, SLAs, KPIs, any other metrics like your customer service or stakeholder feedback, open issues, remediation plans, emerging risks or issues, a place to give your vendor a place to make some commentary or talk about any issues, and a summary statement. So let's look at a scorecard that uses all this information. Okay, so this is a pretty basic scorecard. And I'm keeping that way just because, again, we want to keep it simple on purpose so we can just cover the main points. Now, I have added the snapshot of our dashboard up there and some other charts, which I made in Excel, which you can certainly include as part of your scorecard if you like, as long as you have the other more comprehensive data on there as well. Now, let's take a look. It's a little small, I apologize, but you can see that we're reviewing the whole fourth quarter here. We see the vendor name, and we see the general performance target or company objective listed up there also. Remember, we want to use that as kind of our North Star because we always need to make sure that the vendor's performance is helping us meet that goal. We're also saying if SLAs were met, and if not, which ones. We have an aggregate score for the KPI for the whole time period, and we've used that red, amber, green, or traffic light color coding so we can see any trouble spots. We've also listed our KRIs in the same way for the same reason. Now, on this scorecard, I've included a section for that stakeholder feedback, and it can be very valuable because if you have a diverse group of stakeholders, we need to take them into consideration. We have the list of open issues and remediation plans, and we have a section for the vendor to comment. Now, you may not always see this on a scorecard, but I feel like it's very important for two reasons. One, we want to give the vendor a chance to explain the performance or comment on any issues. When we give the vendor that opportunity, it's really demonstrating that we're kind of actively and collaboratively reviewing the performance. And it's going to serve as sort of a default acknowledgement that the information presented here is correct. Now, that can matter for a few reasons. First of all, if you look at how this vendor is performing, it really hasn't been that great. There's kind of a lot of shortcomings here. And if your organization is getting ready to pull the trigger and terminate a contract, a scorecard like this with the vendor's comments can serve as important legal evidence that the vendor's been made aware and that they have, been given an opportunity to remediate it. This is important in case they try and push back or pursue litigation for improper termination of the contract. It's also a really good idea to put a summary from the vendor owner or relationship manager regarding the performance. So this little short but kind of comprehensive summary can be reviewed by anyone, the management or the board, and they can get a good picture of how the vendor performed and how your organization managed that performance. Now, we do want to make sure that we complete that scorecard and provide it to the vendor in advance of our formal performance review. Now, it's important to remember that we do need to sit down and have a formal discussion about performance periodically. For critical and high-risk vendors, this process should occur at least quarterly. For moderate risk, you can do this probably 1 or 2 times a year, depending on the product or service and what your organization feels comfortable with. And for low risk, the truth is we probably don't need to do a lot in terms of performance management. These engagements are low risk for a reason, so that's really at the discretion of your organization. Okay, so having the review meeting might seem unnecessary if you're regularly addressing issues, but it still is the best practice, and keeping detailed notes and information is strongly recommended so you can have it as evidence of performance monitoring and management. Now, it's important to make sure you take some time to prepare and provide that copy of the scorecard to the vendor. You want to schedule the review meeting and review all the data. You're going to take notes and really get into any issues or remediation plans, talk about next steps, finalize that meeting by adding the vendor owner comments, provide a formal copy to the vendor with your notes, any to-dos, action items, and then keep all those notes, retain that documentation, and follow up on it to make sure that things get done. Okay, so when it comes to our vendors, even our best vendors occasionally have a performance issue, or if we see someone having a performance decline, it's not enough to just say, hey, there's an issue. We have to really think through this in kind of a structured way, and we have to be able to identify the impact. So what is the impact or the potential impact of that decline? Is it a revenue loss? Is it a health and safety violation? Is it waste of resources? Is it costing us more money? We also need to know how severe is it. So how severe are those impacts? Are they going to get worse if we don't fix them? We also need to think about urgency. So is this a critical vendor? Is this going to affect our operations or our customers? And we need to think about the correction effort. So is the issue solvable? What's it going to take to resolve it, and how long could it take? And to answer those questions, it's really helpful to think about sort of what category the performance issue falls into. So is it people related? Is it human error because people haven't been trained or there's not enough resources? Is it a process or procedures issue? People are not following them, or the process is ineffective or inefficient. Or maybe it's a tools issue, so preventative or detective controls aren't working, or they're not suitable for the task at hand. So when we think about those factors, it can really help us identify what the real root cause is and how we should act to resolve it. Now, of course, when we have a performance issue, the vendor has to provide a remediation plan to address the issue. Now, it's really a good practice, especially if issues are complex, reoccurring, or very severe or urgent, to sit with your vendor and really dive into this and make sure that your expectations are understood, that the actions are achievable, that they're time-bound, etc. That vendor in their remediation strategy should provide you the summary of the issue, including how long it's been going on and the impacts. They should be doing some root cause analysis and telling you why this occurred, because this is going to tell us how to potentially fix it. Of course, they need to give us a remediation plan and the timing. We want to make sure all of this is formally documented, that it's opened as an issue on your issue management log, and that it's followed up on until it is closed. Okay, we know that even the best vendors can occasionally have issues. Sometimes they're beyond their control. But what really matters is how the vendor responds to these challenges. We know, not all vendors are created equally. Some are far more professional than others, but sometimes there comes a time when you really start to wonder whether you need to end a relationship due to vendor performance issues. So I can't tell you exactly what's right for your specific situation, but it is usually preferable to try and resolve the issues and maintain the vendor relationship rather than replacing it immediately. But here are some things to consider. So a positive sign of a vendor's commitment is their response to any issue with a clear sense of concern and urgency, especially if they're the ones bringing the issue to your attention. It's really important that vendors take appropriate responsibility, not only for their statements, but for their actions. And this can be demonstrated through, giving you a really good remediation plan. It's going to outline the steps they're going to take and the timeline. You're going to feel more at ease if they keep you updated on their progress, whether or not you prompt them to do so. So all of those behaviors demonstrate not only are they a good vendor, but that they value your business. Now, on the other hand, vendors who refuse to identify issues and avoid discussing performance can create really big problems. They may only be challenging the metrics when a performance issue arises rather than addressing them at the time the contract was established, right? If they're unresponsive and fail to provide remediation plans, that should be a major concern. And even if they do give you some kind of plan, a lack of progress is a big red flag. We also need to be really cautious with vendors who attempt to just pass the blame, claiming that the problem is not their responsibility. These behaviors really signal that your business is not really a priority for them. And in these cases, it may be time to consider finding another provider for that product or service. Okay, Jesse, we've gone through so much information. How about we take our next poll?
Our third and final poll question is, when a critical vendor experiences a performance decline or failure, is it reported to your board? Yes, it depends on the severity of the issue. No, or not sure. Hillary, we can go ahead and answer another question from the audience.
Let's do it.
Great, and this one is, can you get rid of a vendor for performance issues that don't have specific SLAs in the contract?
That is a great question, and the answer is going to be related to what else your contract says. So some contracts, for example, outline more vague conditions like meeting best practices or industry standards, but aren't breaking it down into a service level agreement. You might be able to realistically and without too much impact terminate on those grounds. Another thing is if your contract says you can terminate for convenience, like it doesn't really matter what's going on, you could terminate them. The best thing to do here is to, one, put together a list of the reasons that you would like to terminate the contract related to performance, provide any evidence that you have that can support that, like performance scorecards, etc., and then meet with your legal team to discuss. Because it's hard to answer this with a blanket yes or no. It is possible, but your internal legal team or what legal resources you have will be the best people to answer this directly, because again, it is a contractual relationship. We want to make sure that we're addressing it appropriately. I hope that's helpful.
And here are those results. Thank you everyone for answering this question. Before we continue, I would like to remind everyone that we have our 3 ways to measure Vendit's performance infographic in the related content widget. It's a handy resource to check out. Let's continue with the presentation. Back to you, Hillary.
All right, let's wrap up with some key takeaways. So the first thing is we always want to articulate how that vendor is supporting our organizational goals. It's going to really help us create the most effective performance management for them. We want to use those SLAs to document the most important or non-negotiable requirements in our contract. And we want to make sure that our metrics are balanced between objective and subjective performance measures. We want to make sure that we test performance data occasionally to make sure that it's accurate, and consider the service cycle or transaction length to see how often we should review it. We want to keep our scorecard simple, and we always want to document and track vendor performance issues. And as a last thing, always require documented remediation plans and monitor them. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jessie.
Great, thanks so much, Hillary. Before we dive into more questions and answers, I would like to thank everyone for attending. I would also like to thank Hillary for her time in sharing some important information. On your screen now, you will see our upcoming webinars. On November 12th, Managing Vendor Issues and Challenges at Your Credit Union webinar. And on November 19th, How to Identify and Develop Third-Party Risk Management Program Metrics webinar. We hope you'll be able to join us for those sessions. A link to register for those is in your copy of today's presentation slides. Let's now go ahead and answer some more questions that have come in during this session. Okay, Hillary, our next question is, what are some examples of the type of data that can be collected? We struggle with coming up with some of the KPIs that we can include on our scorecards.
So, when you're thinking about your metrics, the data always has to support the metrics. So, for example, if you're looking at a vendor's uptime, for example, they should be able to provide you the data related to that uptime at the intervals you requested. You can think about just about anything you can measure should have an associated data source. So you could look at inventory reports. You could look at if something's on time or not, price, any quality or defects. Anything that's a direct service to the customer. There should be some customer service metrics, whether that's, those scales of, on a scale of 1 to 5, how satisfied are you, or would you use this again? I think it's more important to make sure that you're measuring the right things, and almost undoubtedly, you will be able to get some sort of data. Now, most of the time your vendor is going to provide that data, but you're also able to collect data as well. So for example, an internal stakeholder survey or, a pricing report from your organization. I hope that answers your question.
Great. Next question. What would be a KPI or KRI for a vendor system such as VinMinder?
Well, certainly, if we look back at our objectives, you would use a system like VinMinder to help you efficiently manage your third-party risk management program. So you might want to look at some, first of all, to be effective, the system has to be up. It has to be running, right? And it should be able to meet all the requirements, like generate reporting or send you notifications. So we'd want to look at that. But also, I think there can be efficiency metrics, like, how long does it take for somebody's changed the status in something? Is that status updated immediately, or is there a lag time? It really depends. I don't want to get too much into systems like VinMinder, but systems do have functionality. That's why you're buying them. So you should be kind of measuring how well that functionality is working and if it's effective in helping you meet your goal.
Great. Next question. What is the difference between the vendor owner summary and stakeholder feedback in the scorecard review?
Okay, so in that example that we showed, and I apologize, it was really small, we had the vendor owner, so that person who's responsible for managing that relationship. But we also had some comments. Again, this was about a call center that wasn't doing very good, and we had some comments from our marketing team saying, hey, their performance is affecting our online reviews. And so that's, kind of impacting what we're doing from a marketing standpoint. Now, you may not always have stakeholders that are that defined, but if you do have them, it is important to kind of figure out how they can participate in that performance review process. But the vendor owner should be looking at all those kind of must-have, meet the service. Stakeholders are folks that are using or affected by that product or service. I hope that helps.
Great. Next question. Do you normally see the vendor relationship owner prepare the SLA dashboard or independent vendor management individuals?
And for the sake of this presentation, your vendor owner is responsible for managing the performance of their vendor, and they should be collecting and populating these dashboards. Third-party risk management in most organizations is kind of fulfilling an oversight role. So you could do things like develop the templates or give them the formats that you want them to use, or make sure that ability is available in your system so they can populate and you can pull reports. But it is the vendor owner's direct responsibility to manage their vendor, and that includes collecting and reporting on performance data.
Great. Our next question here. What is the difference between a KPI and KRI? Some organizations use the terms interchangeably. Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. So this question maybe came up before we talked about it, but just to recap, so the key performance indicator is something that we use to measure performance, but it is a lagging indicator, like we're always looking backwards. So that can be helpful when you're looking at, how well did we perform over time. Your key risk indicators are those metrics that are going to alert you to something, help you avoid risk. So if your customer satisfaction score is dropping just a little bit each time, that could be more of a useful metric to use that as a key risk indicator, because that means you have to go back in and do something so that it doesn't get worse. So those are really the two. Performance indicators are lagging, they're looking back. Key risk indicators are leading, and they're helping you look forward. I hope that helps.
Thanks, Hillary. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have left for questions today. Thanks again, Hillary, for taking the time to address some of those that came in. We would like to thank you all for attending and hope you found today's session valuable. And another big thank you to Hillary for her time and content. You can ask even more questions inside of our third-party think tank. Just because today's session has ended doesn't mean the conversations and questions must. You can post your questions at thirdpartythinktank.com and see what your peers have to say. We did record today's session, and that recording link will be provided to you in a follow-up email that you will receive tomorrow afternoon. Also in the follow-up email will be the survey link for you to request the CPE credit. On behalf of VidMinder, it has been a pleasure. Thank you all, and have a great rest of your day.